Okay, a little delay here for the video watchers. You can see what I'm trying to do because you're using my equipment, but no one in the room can see what I'm trying to do, so we're waiting for the projector to be repaired. As you can see in the corner here, it's blank. So when that gets fixed, we'll start the lecture. Okay, it's fixed, so here we go. Let's see, make sure this is working. Okay, we have, I've got to put my mic on for the real people, the non-digital people. Okay, now everything's turned on. So the loanable funds model is something you want to learn so that when you're older, you can stay there, which is on the beach in Kauai, in a really nice place where it's a short walk to a swim. Your likelihood of being able to stay there for a long time rises proportionate to your understanding of the loanable funds model. So that's why you want to pay attention to this model. We do have an exam coming up. That's one of the downsides of being a college student. You have exams. It's also a downside of being a professor. You have to give them and grade them. So let's talk about that. That'll be given to you after we've completed this section on the loanable funds model. And so it will be a week from today on Tuesday, February 18, and at class time. I will begin to prepare you for that exam on Thursday. I'm going to send out a single email on Thursday. And if you're a person in this class that gets extra time, I'll send out a single email on Thursday that reminds everybody that there's an exam. But it will say in that email that if you're a person who are qualified as a student with disabilities who gets extra time in this class, then I will give you guidance on how to make sure that that is going to work for you. And that will be in that email. And I will ask you to respond to that email to make sure my list of who you are has you on it, all right? And then I will also post a video review giving you guidance on the exam on either Thursday or Friday. And I always do that in this class in Econ 104. It's about a half-hour video, 20 minutes to half an hour, where I cover all the stuff. And I said, here's really what I expect you to know. And that is designed to help you focus your study over the weekend prior to the examination. So you can expect that to be posted on Thursday or Friday. This is going to be an online timed objective exam, which will consist of true, false, multiple choice matching, and you will be given a specified period of time to take. And it's the same exact format that I used in Econ 104 if you had that class. And I used that format in this class last year. Now this is an online exam that requires you to come to class with your laptop, able to take your exam on the laptop, all right? So we meet here, we get all set up, we start the exam. The amount of time that you are given to take the exam is far less than the amount of time we have allocated for the entire class session. So there's plenty of time for everybody to just sit up, get ready to go, and start the exam. You do require, as I say, your laptop because you want to take it on that, so make sure it's charged and you're ready to go. And I'll say more about that, by the way, in the video. Just to remind you, I'll also say more about it in the email I'm going to send you. And I say here it's 40-minute in-class online exam. It might be 32 minutes or 40 minutes. It'll be something like a 30 to 40-minute exam. It depends on the ultimate length of it after I have it put together. It's closed book, no notes, no sharing, and it does have to be taken in the classroom. And not only is the use of laptops allowed, it's actually required. All right. You can listen to music if you want to. And you can have your calculator if you want to. And you can use your phone as a calculator if you want to. And the exam will cover only core material, and that is to say specifically the stuff that is central to the lecture, because I sometimes go off on topical asides and the like, and I'm not going to ask you about that. if there's a topical issue that comes up, I explicitly say this topical issue is a candidate to be on the exam in this way. I don't think that's happened in this class yet. It will by the time the class is done. And so at any rate, you'll take the exam and you'll get your score on the exam as soon as you finish it. And it is a case, by the way, that sometimes the key to the exam or something has an error in it, or we find out later that I have a question that is vaguely worded that a lot of people couldn't understand. I compensate for that with an adjustment process that takes place after it's clear to me that these problems have arisen. And so it usually ends up by adding extra points to the examination itself, just to compensate for those kinds of problems. Usually what happens is I'll take the total score possible on the exam, and then if no one gets a perfect exam, and that's usually the case, although not always the case, then I'll make that person's score 100% and I'll adjust it accordingly. So if the person that has the highest score gets a 96, then I give everyone 4 more points so that that score becomes a 100. And again, I use a standard distribution that is described in the course outline in avid detail, and the grading procedure is described there in detail, so review that if you want. And I try to hit the target of giving 60% of the students, 60 to 65% of the students who take grades, A or A minus, and usually the bulk of that's A, because there's not very many A minuses. Now that ends up being about 70% or so of the students total, because when I say who takes grades, that's excluding pass-fail students. So of the students who end up not taking the course pass-fail, then of those remaining students, then I give 60 or so percent of the students, 60% of the grade. And oh no, I actually said that backwards, I'm sorry. I give 65% of all the students that, and so it ends up that given that how many people take the exam pass-fail, of the students who take grades, it ends up that about 75% of the students who take grades get an A or an A minus. So that's the way it tends to work out. And the distribution I get reflects that. You know, not everybody studies the same amount. You all seem to be kind of equal caliber. I don't think that's too much of a problem here. But the lower part of the distribution will come from people who are waiting to the last minute to look at the lectures. That's where I get the distribution from. I think if all of you just followed my advice and kept up with these video lectures by watching them within 2 or 3 days, closed caption, time and a half, that probably everyone in this class would get an A or an A minus, but people don't. So I guess I get a distribution out of that. So more will be coming up on the exam. Most of it will be an email referencing other things for you to look at or listen to, like the video. So be looking for that kind of information. And again, if you're a student who has earned the right to extra time, that will be taken care of in a single dedicated email. All right, so if you're one of those students, also look for that. I'm, by the way, saying to the video watchers here who are actually in the class, you do need to come to class on exam day. You can't take this exam by video. I would figure out a way to do it if I were going to stay here a little bit longer, but it's just not worth the effort to try to do it for one more class. So you got to show up on February the 18th. Mark your calendar. Okay, now let's keep moving on. This is a 2-part lecture on our second model. The first model was the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. This is a more interesting model to me. It's also more valuable ultimately for policy discussions. It is a financial determination model. It is built into the big simulation model we look at as soon as you take your examination and plays a key role in that simulation model. And we're going to first spend a lot of background fill-in about the financial side of the economy before we look at the model in order to help you understand the model. Now, the model is well explained in Chapter 4 or 3, whatever the chapter is that addresses this model. I think it's a very well-written chapter. It's been around for a very long time. I updated it to make it more topical, but it's been a chapter for about 25 years or so. It is widely cited elsewhere. And I went to this is the one that people like in addition to aggregate supply, aggregate demand. And so people tend to say, yeah, that model was pretty clear. So rely upon the reading to slow down and figure out what parts of the model you don't quite understand. Because most of the discussion of the model's applications, probably all of it actually, will happen on Thursday. So basically, we'll just cover the entire content of applications in a single lecture. We're going to discuss certain types of borrowing and financial assets, means of borrowing, to, again, acquaint you with the role finance actually plays in this economy, at least in the context of this model. Talk briefly about key interest rates, but mostly point out to you that there are various interest rate definitions that are actually included as an appendix to this chapter. And there's only 2 or 3 that I expect you to know, and identify which ones those are today, and also in the video about the exam. I introduced the fundamentals of the loanable funds model, and I'll probably get to that today. And then we draw our primary lessons from the use of the loanable funds model, as we did with the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And we will begin to use the loanable funds model for topical applications. And we'll be using that model for topical applications multiple times in this course for the rest of the semester. Now, the model divides the financial part of the economy into its 2 components: those who are acting on the borrowing side and doing borrowing of all categories, and those that are acting on the lending side, or the side also that purchases financial assets, because that is an act of lending in the context of this model. And by that latter point, I mean, you know what it means when you say a bank makes a loan or a credit union makes a loan. You understand what that means. But when I say when you buy a corporate bond, you are making a loan, you may not see it that way, but in the context of this model, this is how the model treats that. So if you're buying a corporate bond, you're basically providing a loan to the corporation through the institution of a corporate bond. When you are buying a United States Treasury security, such as a 10-year note, then you are loaning money to the United States government. When you buy a municipal state of California revenue bond, you're loaning money to the state of California. So when we talk about lending, that includes traditional, conventional lending, as it's commonly understood by a bank or a financial institution, but it also includes purchases of financial assets by all categories of investors. Now, so when we take a look at this distinction, this little taxonomy we have here, on the borrowing side, then we have all categories of household borrowing, such as you using your credit card, using installment debt to buy an automobile. Installment debt, of course, is a debt where a regular debt payment is made, such as the monthly payment on a car for 5 years. Mortgages, of course, and student loans. On the business side, we have all forms of bank credit that is extended to businesses, but they mostly borrow through the issue of debt instruments, and they are the ones who are selling these very bonds that we're saying possibly you are buying. So under the business category, we have bank credit, which is obvious, but business mortgages, because of course they hold mortgages on their own property, but corporate notes and bonds, such as the kind of bonds that are issued by Apple and Google to finance some of their operations. Even bonds are issued by Harvey Mudd College, believe it or not. And so those are all forms of borrowing. When we look at the federal government, as we're going to see today, because we emphasize their borrowing because it's so large, that the issue of United States Treasury bills, notes, and bonds, and what are called agency bills, notes, and bonds are a form of borrowing. And by agencies, I mean federal agencies like the Federal National Mortgage Association, which borrows money to help fund housing and the like, and other agency borrowing. But mostly in this class, we'll be talking about U.S. Treasury borrowing, which is borrowing directly by the United States government. But as I say, they borrow through the sale of bills, notes, and bonds, these various financial assets. And state and local governments are the same, except that their bills, notes, and bonds are called municipal bills, notes, and bonds. That's their title. And the shortage for that is often called munis. So people say in the finance markets they issue munis, or the state of California 5-year muni has a yield of 4.5% and the like. All right? So these categories of borrowing will be reflected by the loanable funds model. On the lending side, those who are providing money to the market for the purpose of others to borrow, households do this when you save money. It, of course, is an indirect route that it becomes money that is provided to borrowers. But if you save money at a bank, then it provides funds for the banking to relend it to somebody else, and so that's what we're saying. Your retirement investments are a very heavy level of lending. We're excluding here, by the way, the purchase of stocks, because that's not a form of debt, and we're not talking. You can modify the loanable funds model to include stocks, but we don't have that modification in ours. So playing the stock market, buying 100 shares of Google is not, in this category, classified as a type of lending, because it's not a loan. It's you're buying an asset.
So to further distinguish corporate stock from a corporate note or bond.
Yeah.
So can a private company that's not publicly traded sell corporate notes?
Whatever is issued as an equity position, no matter how it's defined, where the person in a legal sense owns a piece, albeit tiny, of that business, that is not classified as lendable funds. Okay. If, on the other hand, it can be in any way construed as an actual debt that has a payment obligation associated with it and earns an interest, it would be classified as loanable funds. And then continuing on in the government, our own Federal Reserve System deserves a special status in this discussion because they have the ability, and only they have the ability, to provide unfunded credit creation. So they can provide funds to the markets with no source, which is to say they can create the credit from nothing and provide it to the market, and that's their primary function. They can create it out of thin air, as we'll see. So we have borrowing and lending separated in the context of the jargon of the model. It's a very traditional model. When we are talking about the borrowing side and the activity of those on the borrowing side, that is called the demand for funds in this model. And that's not consistent with the way these terms are used in the vernacular, but it's the way the model has always been set up. So if you were borrowing for any reason, no matter who you are, then you are exercising your demand for funds in the context of this model. If you are on the lending side, then you are supplying funds to this market, and your activity is represented as the supply of funds. So the Federal Reserve System, when they are creating credit from nothing, are supplying funds and the like. Now, we are going to exclude, aside from an occasional footnote about it, the overseas borrowing from and lending to in these discussions because they complicate it a bit too much. When we talk about the demand for federal funds later in the class, when we talk about the demand for Treasury securities later in the class, I'll point out to you and show data where a lot of that comes from overseas, but right now we're going to gloss over that issue and not introduce it into the model because it complicates it far too much. So we're not saying it doesn't exist, we're just saying we're not representing it here quite yet. So this model brings all of the actors together into a single equilibrium model and represents the finance markets as that structure, which uses a series of prices that we call interest rates as a special class of market clearing prices. So the interest rate on your 30-year mortgage is a type of price that is a market clearing price, presumably. And so the model tries to identify why the behavior of those special market clearing prices, why the behavior of those interest rates changes, and what effect that change has upon the economy. All right? So that's the sense of who this model is meant to represent. Now let's talk a little bit about how debt is actually used in this economy so we can have a sense of what this model is likely to tell us. This graph right here has always been one that I identify as significant when discussing trends in the U.S. economy. And so this is domestic non-financial debt. In other words, this does not include the indebtedness of financial institutions to anyone, because that would be double counting. That's the sense in what it means non-financial. This is the indebtedness of everyone except the indebtedness of financial institutions to their own depositors. And the reason that that would be double counting, if that would be counted, is you make a deposit in your savings account, and that technically on the books of a bank is a debt of the bank to you, and then the bank takes that money and lends it to somebody else, and that's a debt of the bank, of that person to the bank. We can't count both of those. We can only count one of them. So we count the final step in that, the person that's borrowing from the bank. So this is effectively how much we are in debt in the economy in the numerator, domestic non-financial debt totals, divided by our capacity to honor the debt through income, which is national income. So this is kind of a proxy for a nationwide debt to income ratio. How high is our debt given our income? And this covers the period between 1962 and 2019. We're looking at annual data here. And you can see that this is, might guess, kind of leading already to a conclusion from it, that this is likely to be one of the reasons why this economy has expanded as it has over the period of time here in question. If this had not grown as it did from its older value from the 1960s of 1.5 to 1, then this economy would be very, very pushed back compared to where it actually is now. This is a massive engine of growth in the U.S. economy. And when this value rises in any economy, it is an engine of growth. Because, of course, once you start using debt, as is suggested in this slide, you are no longer constrained by your income per se. You're constrained by your income plus whatever delta in credit that you're using to push this number up. And so this expansion of debt explains in part, but not entirely, the expansion of the economy. Now, you'll notice how I have it labeled such that for about 20 years, only of which about 15 are actually shown on the graph, because going back before 1962, it was stable for a lot longer than shown here. This ratio was stable. This ratio was consistently right around about 1.5, 1.6, 1.7. There was actually an academic article published in around 1978 or 79 that I used to refer to, but I lost the reference, that argued that structurally it's not possible for this number to be higher than 1.5. They said this is something stable about an economy. This number is always going to be 1.5 because it always had been 1.5 until it wasn't any longer 1.5. And then it increased from 1.5 rapidly, in fact, as you can see, to about 2.2 or 2.3. And then in the 90s, it kind of trickled back and then went after that through an astonishing spurt, starting around 1998, up to a new peak that we hit at the time of the heat of the mortgage expansion. And then it collapsed back a little bit as the crisis from that worked its way out, but has remained stable at that peak ever since. And as you can see, it's at a peak of about 3.0. And so that means the amount of net domestic debt relative to income in this economy is at about 3. And it used to be 1.5, so it has doubled in my lifetime. It actually doubled in my lifetime minus about 15 years, actually. So as I say here, this is kind of a national proxy for our debt divided by our capacity to pay for it. Now I write down there at the bottom, this is the root of future trouble, because if it is the case that to get growth, ultimately this has to rise, it can't really go much higher than this probably, because it represents a substantial burden upon the economy to have to pay debt service for this. So,
So how we're counting this?
how
So,
what?
So we're counting this average? So is that the total debt at any one time versus the annual income?
Yeah.
So it's
This
not
is basically the debt as a numerator divided into the capacity to pay it. If it was for you, somebody would ask, as they do when you apply for a mortgage, what is your current debt to income ratio for installment debt, for example? And the threshold on that for a mortgage is typically no higher than 0.35, or in some cases no higher than 0.40 for just revolving debt, credit card debt and the like. That's actually a qualification question to get a mortgage. So this is all categories of debt for the entire economy. So it's a proxy for that kind of thing.
So would that mean that, because like even 1.5, it wouldn't necessarily seem stable to have more debt than income? Was that because the debt is paid off over a longer period?
No, it has nothing to do with the debt being paid off. The debt effectively in this economy is a perpetuity. In that, sure, individual, even for people, let alone for the abstraction of the economy as a whole, because nobody ever really pays off their debt until they're in their 60s or 70s, and that's because they pay off their mortgage. And aside from that, basically, as you live through your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and even 60s, your debt will continue to grow. It may or may not grow as fast as your income, but it will continue to grow, typically. For some people, of course, who get wealthy, they pay it down, but that's actually quite rare. Now, when you take a look at the economy, the debt is just a number that grows. But the economy also is just a number that grows, so this is clearly growing faster than that, if that's true. Now, when we have this period where I say the 80s discover credit, you may recall that I identified some of this change in the structure due to technology, believe it or not, and recall that I told you the story about Bob Isaac, whose grandson was a Harvey Mutter, went to school here. His name was Bob Isaac also. And he invented the credit score, and ultimately that made it possible for banks to move from a passive attitude about accepting loan applications to very aggressive marketing where they push loan applications upon anyone who might want to borrow. Telling you, for example, through an advertisement that appears in your mail, hey, you can get this credit card with an upper limit of $25,000. All you have to do is fill in the blanks here and send it back to us, and we'll give you a credit card, and you can use it all or none of it next month if you want. You can book a cruise around the world, or you can not use it for anything. And so that was made possible by the technology of credit scoring, because instead of using a committee to evaluate your credit worthiness, Bob Isaac and his colleagues at Fair Isaac and others were doing this. He wasn't the only one, but he's sort of like Eli Whitney is the invention of the cotton gin, right? Well, a lot of people were working on cotton gins back then. Eli Whitney just turned out to be the guy that either was first or the most noticed. And so same thing with this. Bob Isaac obviously wasn't the only one working on this. But they said we can move this to a marketing issue. And so, of course, people responded to that by using the credit card offers and the auto loan offers. You've seen advertisements even today. I saw one trying to sell the new Corvette, the new mid-engine Corvette, the 2020 Corvette. These things are about, 55,000 or so up which is not very much actually for a car these days. And they're advertising them in the paper by saying 0 down, 7 years to pay it off at 0 interest, actually, to make it more appealing to buy the Corvette. Well, obviously, people respond to that, and so that resulted in this credit explosion that we see here between about 1980 and about the year 2000 or so. Now, it was actually tapering off. The technology effect was done within 10 years because we went from a passive loan economy to an aggressive marketing-based loan economy in 10 years, and so that was complete. And wealth was rising considerably because of the growth of the stock market and the NASDAQ with the furious spurt in the value of technology stocks. So Americans were kind of paying this debt back a little bit because of the wealth they were making in the stock market. Remember, I was saying the wealth effect can really spur a lot of activity And in this case, it had the tendency to roll this ratio back down a little bit until we had the crash that wiped all the wealth out. And then, of course, then it shoots up really high. And then we get into the millennium craziness, as I call it, where basically after the year 2000, we just started using debt for absolutely everything. And a considerable part of that spurt was due to the excessive use of debt for mortgages that people couldn't pay back. And so ultimately that peaked and, of course, came back down because of a lot of that debt was liquidated as worthless. And so that stabilized it where it still remains at a more or less stable level right now. It's not showing any tendency to rise very much, and this is current data up until December of 2019. So it's fairly stable at 3.0. So this matters a lot, obviously, in an economy. And when this changes, it rises or falls, it's going to have either a stimulating effect when it rises or possibly a negative effect when it falls. But it could be the negative effect is actually due to prosperity, as it was between 96 and 99, or it could be due to economic problems, as it was from 2007 to, say, 2009. So this is the root of future trouble, though, if it can't rise very much, because this is kind of how the economy's growth has been funded over all these years. Your consumption has been funded by, speaking to you abstractly as consumers, but businesses, of course, have borrowed very, very heavily. And as we see on this slide right here, the federal government has been the heaviest borrower of all. Its activities are, for the largest part now, funded by debt, or the margin in its activities, because the U.S. government is spending about the U.S. government is borrowing about 20 to 25 cents for every dollar that it spends. Now, with this kind of staggering growth, in 2019, the third quarter, which is the most recent quarter for which we have these debt numbers, this data is compiled by the Federal Reserve System and is referred to as the flow of funds data, or sometimes called the Z.1 data. This goes up to 2019 quarter three. And the total indebtedness represented on that previous slide is $53.8 trillion. That's how much debt exists in the U.S. economy, of which shown there in the decomposition of it is all but $1.3 trillion. The smaller category is not shown. And so going from left to right, home mortgage debt, as you might guess, is high, and the second highest private category at $10.5 trillion, so we have $10 trillion in mortgage debt. Consumer credit is at $4 trillion. Corporate debt is very high also at $10 trillion. Corporations will borrow copious amounts of money even if they are completely flush with cash. Apple, of course, is a very, very heavy borrower every year, and Apple has the largest cash reserve of any entity in the world, tens of billions of, or not tens of billions, but billions of dollars in cash. And there are tax reasons for doing that. It used to be, until recently, that it made sense to keep your cash in Europe and then borrow in the United States because of tax laws. And that has largely been eliminated, or the tax privilege has been eliminated, but they still pursue that practice. But the primary reason that they borrow simply because they can. Effectively, if interest rates are as low as they are right now, and you're Apple and you can borrow at, say, 3.5% or 4%, the feeling is you can make more money on that than 4 or 5%, so why use your own money to do that? Get the leverage out of borrowing and pass all the value on to your shareholders. Apple and other large corporations also borrow staggering amounts of money to buy back their own stock. And that has the effect of raising the value of the individual shares of the stock in the stock market. So that goes on a staggering scale. All the large corporations now buy their own stock back using borrowed money. And the effect of that is to actually reduce the amount of shares outstanding for these corporations to a smaller and smaller amount every year. So I don't know how much Apple has bought. I do have the data, but I don't remember what the data says. But they've they've bought back, I don't know, something like 20% of their stock, although that number could be considerably higher or lower than well, it's not going to be considerably lower than, higher than the actual number, because it is a lot. All right? So we're in debt, and we're the borrowers, and that debt is sizable. Now, we're going to spend a little more time talking about the U.S. government's budget deficit, because the deficit itself plays such a critical role in discussing fiscal policy and economic policy in general, and this class is about policy to some extent, or to a great extent. And so this class of debt plays a considerable role upon how this economy performs over time. So here I'm pointing out to you, I maybe have already showed you this once. I think this is the second time you've seen this, but if not, the federal government's budget deficit, which is the difference between their spending and what they take in receipts from taxation, that deficit is financed by the sale of interest-bearing United States Treasury securities to the public, to corporations, financial institutions, foreign investors, including foreign central banks, of countries which have been running a trade deficit, like the Bank of China, OPEC, Sovereign Fund, etc., and even to our own central bank, the Federal Reserve System, indirectly. So the U.S. government finances this spread, this difference between what they spend and what they take in taxes by borrowing the difference, the budget deficit, through exclusively the sale of these classes of securities. And they are identified as U.S. Treasury bills, U.S. Treasury notes, or U.S. Treasury bonds. And those differ by maturity, and that is the length of time that you hold the asset, earning interest on it, until its full coupon value is paid off by the Treasury. So you might, for example, if you bought a 2-year note, you invest $10,000 in the 2-year note. It pays interest to you semi-annually, 2 payments per year, and at the end of 10 years, the U.S. Treasury buys the note back from you for $10,000. And that cycle goes on forever. You could buy a 4-week bill. Bills have maturities of less than 1 year, and they are currently offered in these maturities for 13, 26, and 52 weeks. So you can buy a 13-week Treasury bill where the Treasury pays you back in 13 weeks, or 1 year, 52 weeks. And you can buy a note instead, and that has a maturity of between 1 and 10 years, more than 1 and to 10 years, and that's called a note. And currently those are issued in maturities of 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, and 10 years. So you can buy a 7-year note, 5-year note, and in all cases, the note is paid off at the end of that time span. They sell bonds in 20 and 30-year maturities, and right now they're issuing only 30-year maturities. And they sell a type of asset called inflation index notes and bonds that I have here as a footnote. They don't sell very many of them, and those are issued in all maturities. Now, of what I expect you to remember of this is the primary maturities, not the individual examples. So I do expect you to remember that a bill has a maturity of 1 year or less, that a note has more than 1 year to 10 years, and that a bond is longer than 10 years. That's what I think is reasonable to expect you to remember. I don't expect you to remember that there's a 13, 26, 52-week bill. Okay? These are sold at competitive interest rates in a Dutch auction. It's a complicated sales process that's described in Econ 104. And those rates, though, that they're sold at are not determined by fiat. That is, they're not declared by the U.S. Treasury or the government. They're competitive. They're determined by an auction. And they vary from maturity to maturity, and they vary over time as market interest rates change. These financial assets, these Treasury bills, notes, and bonds, can be and are traded aggressively on a secondary market. So you can buy a 10-year Treasury note, and you can sell it tomorrow. Or you can sell it a year from now. Or you can sell it in 6 years. They're sellable, and it's a very active and very liquid market. So these are sold and resold, and therefore their price and their effective yield is subject to conditions of that market. Their yield and price actually changes over time as market conditions change. All right? Now, for practical purposes, by the way, you say, well, if the Treasury redeems its debt, which it does by definition here, that determines the maturity, then why does the debt persist? Because the practice for all governments, including the U.S. Treasury, is when a bill, note, or bond matures, it is financed by simply selling another one. So the deficit actually constitutes net new issue beyond what is already circulating each year. So when a 10-year note is redeemed, it's financed by selling another 10-year note, with the footnote that they no longer match maturities necessarily because they don't have to. They can sell a 10-year note. They can redeem a 10-year note by selling a 7-year note for the same amount. And they tend to sell these, by the way, in weekly auctions. And the amount sold, as you can tell, given that the deficit itself is $1 trillion a year, is a few score $1 million for every class of asset that they sell in their weekly auctions. So this weekly auction might be for $50 million worth of 3-year Treasury notes, or $140 million worth of 10-year notes, and the like, one after the other throughout the year, okay? So this is how the debt number for the Treasury, which is the bar with the 18.9 trillion on the top, where that comes from. Now, by the way, when we look at the Treasury numbers, we will often see numbers like 16.7, 18.9, 17.3. They don't appear to exactly match up. And that's because you have to state what it is you're actually including in that number and excluding. And also, of course, given that it's growing so fast, if you look at a June number, it's going to look a lot different than a September number. And the availability of these aggregates is sporadic throughout the year. So we're saying ballpark around 18 or $19 billion, okay? So now, part of that distinction that I just said is some of it is called marketable debt, and some of it is not marketable debt. And so when we calculate the value of the marketable debt only, that total comes out to $16.322 trillion for September 2019. So you say, going back to this one, you say the total is 18.9. The amount that is marketable is 16.3. So there's got to be a category of debt that is referred to perhaps as non-marketable debt, and that is the case. When we talk about the marketable debt, this is the most important category of debt. It is unambiguously the indebtedness of the United States Treasury to outside parties. Some of the debt is counted internally, such as the debt to the Social Security system associated with the Social Security Trust Fund. So whether you count that as debt or not, since it's kind of a loan from the right hand to the left hand, is subject to debate. We'll come across that issue in the final third of the class. Right now, we'll say let's focus on the indebtedness of the U.S. government to outside parties. That's the marketable debt. And those are, once again, our bills, notes, and bonds. And then we have some of these floating rate securities that don't amount to very much. Well, they're starting to. Treasury inflation-protected securities, again, as I said, is kind of a minor category that these days is growing more important. But bills, notes, and bonds, the bills are 2.3 trillion, notes 9.8 trillion, bonds 2.3 trillion. These exotics, such as the Treasury's TIPS, 1.9 trillion, and the total marketable debt of that is 16.322 trillion. Now, again, what this is debt that can be resold and is resold and could be in the hands of anyone. It's sold on a so-called open market, which means anyone can bid on it. You can bid on it. Your parents can bid on it. Your parents' pension fund can bid on it. A state or local government, an insurance company, a corporation, a Russian citizen, a Chinese citizen, a South Korean citizen, a Russian, Chinese, or South Korean corporation, or the government of Russia, China, and South Korea can bid on it. And all of them own some of this, okay? So we'll keep that in mind as we talk about the use of fiscal policy through this model to affect interest rates. That's why we're giving it so much attention now. Now there's another category that's kind of interesting that I throw in here because it comes up a couple of times. And this is this is here mostly to show you how sophisticated sometimes this lending can become. When you use your credit card, if it has a bank's name on it, it doesn't necessarily mean that the bank provided the money to fund your credit card. It could merely mean that the bank is simply servicing your loan payments for a fee, and that money comes from another source. In many cases, a corporation, the name of which you would never recognize in a million years, right? Because a lot of these large financial corporations aren't branded at the consumer level, but your credit card is branded at the consumer level by a bank. But that doesn't mean the bank is funding the card. Sometimes these are rather exotic, such as this collateralized debt obligation that has become prominent. Now, this used to be a big part of my lecture, except that recent regulations have reduced the attractiveness of these CDOs. And so they're sort of stable, albeit important. They're no longer growing. But this is nonetheless how they work when they are working. And mortgages are done this way, which is another reason I'm showing you this, because when we get to a discussion of the mortgage meltdown, this structure comes back in a very big way. So let's say you have a credit card from a bank, and you have a credit card, and each of you, in fact, has 2 or 3 credit cards, a lot of credit cards. People have credit cards. And you say, who do I actually owe that money to? Well, you don't typically owe it to the bank whose name is on the credit card. You owe it to a pool, and that pool is a structure called a collateralized debt obligation that was created by simply assembling all of these credit cards and their paperwork into an enormous pool, maybe of 20 million credit cards in the single pool. And so basically your payment, cash coming out and payment going into that pool, is aggregated. And the pool is represented by this big blue orb in the center. So you're effectively making payments, you're borrowing from the pool and you're making payments to the pool. And then the pool's ownership is divided into pieces, and that is sold to investors. And those pieces are called tranches. So the tranches will have privileges associated with them, for example, and they will have individual credit ratings. So there might be a premium grade superior tranche of some kind, for example, and those are for the credit cards in this pool for people who have a high FICO score, like above 720. So there might be what they would call perhaps an investment grade tranche, and that is the component of this pool associated with people who have credit scores of above 720, for example. There would be a less attractive tranche like the A17 tranche, which might be associated with people who have credit scores below 620 or so. So all the cash flow going to and coming out of that is owned by these owners of these tranches. Now, the reason I have this here, because that's kind of complicated, and maybe a bit too much to ask to remember for the loanable funds model, is because you need to appreciate how complicated sometimes these lending and borrowing structures can get. This comes back to haunt us a bit when we start talking about mortgages that were collateralized like this in 2003, 4, 5, and 6. Those became the famous collateralized mortgage obligations, CMO, structured like that nearly destroyed the global economy and still has repercussions to this day in the form of policy adjustments to that disaster. So for purpose of the exam, I'm just going to ask you maybe what is peculiar about a CDO in a true-false question or something like that. Well, it's arranged into the loan. The person borrowing the money and the person lending the money are separate from each other because the tranches aren't in any way connected to your credit cards directly, nor are your credit cards connected in any way to an investor directly. You're just feeding into two sides of a pool, and the cash flow going through that pool goes back and forth between the two of you. By back and forth, I mean you can use the credit card and take money out. You can make a payment on the credit card and put money back in. And so that cash flow, positive and negatives, flows to the tranche investors. Their primary investment, of course, is they purchased the pool when they first created the CDO. And they don't throw a lot of money in a pool and say, go ahead and lend it. Banks assemble all of these loans from their own funds, and then they sell them to these CDOs to get rid of the asset and the liability at the same time, see. So the tranche all of a sudden appears out of nowhere as a $5 billion tranche or something like that.
So in this example, we're talking about Visa, but would like MasterCard have their own, Amex would have their own?
Yeah.
And like the number of how big the tranche is that dependent on like how many card owners? Because like Amex has less card owners, so it has less tranches to pay into the pool.
Well, the role that are played by these big name companies like that, including the banks that Visa uses, for example. To some extent, MasterCard and Visa are marketing firms, and they are fee processing firms more than they are anything else. The banks and those companies, to some extent, actually fund initially your credit card loan, right? You get a credit card, first day you get it from Bank of America, then Bank of America is loaning you that money for a while. But they consolidate all of that into, say, 2 million credit card loans. They bundle that and sell it off while still processing the payment. So they still get paid the payment processing fee, but they no longer have the loan. The loan's in this CDO that they bundle it and threw it into. The investors could be like Saudi Arabian Sovereign Oil Fund or something like that. The investors can be absolutely anybody who's buying the cash flow of all of this. And these are pretty lucrative because we pay high interest rates for our credit card use. So these are attractive investments. Now again, this type of structure has stalled because of changes in regulations, but it's still out there right now. Okay, so this gives you kind of an overview of at least a couple of categories of lending. So we are reminding ourselves that we're talking about something in this generalization that can get pretty sophisticated sometimes. So let's make a few observations about interest rates, which we're going to start talking about now. There are as many interest rates in an economy as there are yield-bearing financial assets in circulation, because each individual asset has its own yield, its own interest rate. So there is a dense continuum of interest rates in a large economy like this, not just the interest rate, obviously. And so every single Treasury security that is actually issued at a slightly different interest rate. Like every 10-year note outstanding actually has a slightly different coupon yield, because the coupon yield that it has, the original yield that it pays, was determined on the day of its auction. And interest rates go up and down, so that's different every day. So you may see a whole bunch of them side by side. One of them still having 7 years to go. The one right next to it having 6 years and 11 months to go. The one next to it having 6 years and 10 months to go. And they will all have coupon yields that are a little bit different, because the yield was determined as the interest rate effectively on the day of the actual issue. All right. So every single one of those is an interest rate. There's two types of assets that offer interest. One of those is yields on deposits in financial institutions, which you may think of as the interest rate. And these are sticky and slow to change. So bank deposit rates, which don't matter very much in this economy, are sticky. And the yields on marketable securities like U.S. Treasury bonds or corporate bonds, which can change in value minute by minute, because these securities are traded in a huge secondary market. And so we have very fluid interest rates for some classes of securities, where literally you have if you walk into my office, you'll see all those graphs up. Only about half of those are for stocks. The others, a couple of them for futures markets like exchange. The rest are for bonds, and they go up and down just like stocks. So the price of a bond can rise and fall just like a stock, and in the same percentage terms. And so that means its yield is changing just as fast. Many of the loans that you obtain for student loans, credit cards, auto finance, mortgages were originally funded by combining the loans into a huge pool of loans called CDOs, which in turn are sold as yield-bearing financial assets with either market-determined competitive yields and fixed maturities, or as pass-through securities where the investors earn the interest that you pay, and that was the previous slide that I showed you. But most of our interest is on the second category of fluid rates that are effectively interest rates on corporate bills, notes, and bonds, treasuries, munis, and the things like that. To continue, intermediary financial institutions like banks and commercial mortgage and credit card lenders make their profits not on the level of interest rates, but on the spread between interest rates, between their cost of funds, the deposit interest rate of the yields on the financial assets that they issue, and what they charge for their loans. So the profitability of this business does not depend upon the level of rates. It depends upon the spread in rates between what these institutions are paying for their cost of funds and what they lend it to you at. Although there are often exceptions, interest rates in general rise and fall together as market conditions change. And it's remarkable to the extent to which they do. So interest rates will go up together and they'll go down together as market conditions change. Therefore, for the purpose of an introductory macroeconomics class, we can refer to the full spectrum of interest rates as, quote, the interest rate without too much loss. And because there is no single interest rate, there's not even a key rate that we would want to follow as a bellwether or a benchmark. There are such rates, such as the Treasury 10-year rate or the 30-year mortgage rate, but they are so different from each other that we just abstract and talk about the interest rate rising in the context of this model, which means that the general direction of interest rates in general are rising in reference to that. Theories about the full spectrum of interest rates are taught in classes like Econ 104. It's also the case, typically, although not so much right now, that financial assets with higher risk have higher yields. And more important, financial assets with longer maturities have higher risk and therefore higher yields when compared to short-term maturities. So an asset that has a longer maturity, like 20 years, will have a higher yield typically than a risk equivalent asset that has 10 years maturity or 7 years maturity will be even lower than those two. And 13-week bills would even be lower yet than those. So we'll see that that is normally the case, but it's not the case right now. And that's going to be one of our very first interesting observations. Now, the interest rates that we'll be talking about are mostly on this page. The two from this page that I would expect you to remember are the ones in blue. I used to require students know a little bit more out of the interest rate spectrum, but it seemed tedious, I think, to students that I asked you to memorize them. So now I want you to remember what the 10-year note rate is for the U.S. Treasury, because that's our bellwether rate for a lot of things that we do. And the federal funds rate will become very important, and that is the short-term Federal Reserve interbank lending rate. So that I kind of want you to remember. When we talk about the prime rate, the mortgage rate, installment rates, and the like, those are described in the handout at the end of the PDF and at the end of this slide section. So you can look over those, but I'm not going to ask you questions about them on the exam. I want you to kind of be aware of what those terms mean, but I'm not going to ask you questions about them on the exam, okay? Mostly what we're going to be talking about, for purposes of this exam at least, is why rates in general rise and fall. We don't need to, therefore, distinguish much between types of rates. I have already said, though, that I do want you to know the difference between a U.S. Treasury bill, note, and bond, okay? Because I think that is important to know. Now, we still have to justify why we care about this, and so we can ask this question, why do interest rates matter as much as they do? Well, if they're the cost of credit and debt, and if this is a credit-based economy, if there ever was one. This economy lives or dies on credit for the largest part. And that's because we're the ultimate consumer economy, and consumerism is driven by credit in the modern era. Because of credit cards, because of consumer durables and mortgages, and not just mortgages to buy a house, refi mortgages to roll over so you can buy stuff by taking equity out of your house with a second trust deed. Refinancing your house to get cash out of it to buy stuff with that. And so a lot of consumer spending, in spurts at least, is financed by mortgages, not just the purchase of a house. Debt service, which is your obligation to pay your debt in an orderly way for amortized debt, can be a problem in a country like this. And when it's a problem, it becomes a very serious problem. It can be a problem in any country, but in a country that relies so heavily upon debt, it can be a very serious problem. Interest rates matter because real estate lives or dies by interest rates. Simple as that. At times like this, when interest rates are at near record low levels, real estate is thriving and housing prices are rising. Even though this economy is not very strong compared to what it was in, say, 2003, it was only apparently strong then, housing prices in the Southern California area last year still rose, typically in excess of 7% for each county in Southern California. That's remarkable, given that the underlying inflation rate is only 2%. So housing prices rose at a 5% premium over the inflation rate, so the real return on housing is 5% or so. If interest rates were to move up to levels that were seen at the time I first came to Harvey Mudd College, the real estate market would just flat out die. There would be basically no construction at all. And so everything in between is possible. These interest rates are an international barometer of national strength and price stability. If you have interest rates that are really high, you've got inflation, typically, not always, but typically. And we know what that's all about. And so they, of course, affect the financial markets. When they're higher, they're generally harmful to the financial markets. One of the reasons that the stock market just keeps going up and up and up and up no matter what, as it, for example, went up a staggering 20-some% last year as measured by the NASDAQ, is because of low interest rates. If interest rates were to spurt upward, that would stop. The stock market would stop. And this produces a very, very heavy wealth effect, which causes us to continue to spend. I am still, against my wife's wishes, strongly against my wife's wishes, angling to buy my brand new Bentley Bentayga W12 Speed. I think I need a 700 horsepower car for my daily commute from Rancho Cucamonga to Harvey Mudd College. I'll offset the green effects by driving my e-tron whenever I can, which takes no gasoline at all. And so even though the W12 only gets 9 miles to the gallon because it has 750 horsepower, I'm only going to be driving it 9 miles. And so it'll only take 1 gallon to get here and 1 gallon to go home. Okay? And I won't be able to buy it just by writing out a check. I could, but it would kind of dent my retirement funds if I did that. I need credit to do that. And whether I actually end up doing it kind of depends upon how wealthy I feel. If I feel really wealthy, then I'm going to display that wealth by one day parking a Bentayga out there in the parking lot. My problem is, though, that I've started looking at the Rolls-Royce Cullinan, and now I'm starting to think about it. So I can't even afford the Bentayga, and I'm already thinking along the lines of the Cullinan. The reason is because when you open the door of a Cullinan and it's raining, there's an umbrella right here in the door that you can pull directly out that's made by Rolls-Royce, and so it's of the highest possible quality. And it's only $240,000 more to get the Cullinan, so why not, right? Well, that's the wealth effect. When you start to feel wealthy, then you start thinking like I'm thinking right now. When the market turns down and there's a grasp of reality, then you stop thinking about buying Bintegas and go back to your Nissan Leaf. International capital flows are also very strongly influenced by relative interest rates. And as we'll see when we get to the discussion on international trade, that matters. Now, again, before we get into the model, we're going to talk about some of the stuff in the background, because as we use the model, I'll be talking about these things, like the yield curve. So one of the phenomenon that says a lot, right now I'm just introducing what the phenomenon is without telling you anything about what it says about anything, is the so-called Treasury yield curve, the yield curve. And this is 2008 that you're looking at here, not the current. And this is considered a more or less normal-looking yield curve. It slopes upward as shown. And again, remember I said when I generalized that securities that have a longer maturity have a higher yield. And that is reflected in this. And so when we take a look at these, we see the 3-month had an interest rate of 1%, a yield of 1%. The 3-year about 1.75. The 20-year up above 3, and the 30-year at about 4.25. And that is pretty close to the historical average for the yields for this mix of securities. This is sometimes called the term structure of interest rates. So if you hear people say the term structure of interest rates has gone flat, that means that this has gone flat for the largest part, right? Now this is what a normal one looks like. Starts low, goes up. This is what ours looks like now. And ours is the one on the blue. It's relatively flat everywhere. The yield on 1 month is as high as the yield on the 10-year. In fact, right across the board, they're identical, which is really rare. 1.85, 1.85, 1.85. And this is a daily piece of data taken from February the 10th, 2020. Only when you get out past the 10-year note do you see an increase. And the increase is still to a level of only 2% for, astonishingly, a 30-year bond. Now, therefore, this yield curve does not properly reflect risk associated with buying the asset. That can turn out to be a serious problem, and probably at some point will turn out to be a serious problem. In reference to the current blue line, I'm showing the April 29th red line, which actually came from a lecture in this class at the end of last year. And you can see that it also was flat. It's fairly rare for a yield curve to be flat if you go way back in history and look at the daily rates. But it was higher. You can see considerably higher, in fact, almost a full percentage point higher. So the 30-year, for example, then was 3, now it's 2. The 1 month was 2.4, and now it's about 1.6, etc. And so this reflects the reality of the fact that the Federal Reserve System, even though interest rates were actually already really low compared to, say, this, at the higher end at least, pushed them even lower, almost by a full percentage point. So that reflects current policy, and it's a policy that has had the effect of flattening the yield curve. And so that is discussed a lot in the financial press. What does a flat yield curve imply? And we'll come back and use the loanable funds model to some extent to talk about that. Right now I'm just introducing you to what the yield curve means and showing you that this is typical. This is not. They have been lower on the short end though. This was 2016, 2017 February dates. So, wow, in 2016, the 1 month was at 0? Yeah, it was. That was the deflationary period when commodity prices for oil and copper and everything was going down for a short time. And interest rates for ultra-short securities globally, not just in the United States, but also Japan and Germany, actually had negative yields. And so our 1 month U.S. Treasury bill had effectively a yield of 0%. And by 2017, it was higher than that, but still close to 0. But you can see at least it had a positive slope back then. That is to say, longer assets had higher risk associated with them. 2017, the 30-year bond had a 3% yield. But back now, they have pretty much the same yield as something less than 1 year. Now, there's a reason why they have a positive yield. They're associated with more risk. And so if you read about this in the newspaper, especially the financial press like the Wall Street Journal, they'll say that these assets are mispriced because risk is not being properly priced into these assets. And there was never a statement made that's more true than that. That's the nature of bonds in general at the present time. Risk is not properly priced into them. And so we'll talk about the possible repercussions of that when the market finally corrects itself. Right now, we'll just realize they are low and flat, okay? Now, these rates over time, I told you they're near all-time historical lows. It really depends upon what you're talking about. The 30-year, the long-term rates are at historical lows. They've never been lower than they are right now. The bottom represents that. And going back to these, we say, yeah, back in 2017, 16, when rates were just pushed down into deflationary levels, they were still 3% or 2.5%. Now, they are 2%. So the long-term bond rates are absolutely at all-time historical lows. And the shorter rates are not. They went to zero, as I just showed you, around 2016 and 17, and they're still low, but they're 1.45%, and they were zero effectively. So they're a different rate than that. Oh yeah, right. Yeah. I put that up to show you how stupid all of this expensive machine learning crap is, right? So so of course, as you do your honest to God work on your computer, you're typing all of these terms into Google, searching for this stuff, right? What is the 10-year note rate, or what is the what's the Treasury? What is the U.S. Treasury rate, right? Type into Google, what is the 10-year U.S. Treasury rate? And so meanwhile, Google and Apple and everyone else is spying on you, and their machine learning programs are like classifying you, and preparing you for your death or whatever they plan to do with you, and so forth. And meanwhile, so you go to Amazon literally an hour later, and Amazon all of a sudden is advertising Treasury stuff, such as, what does that one say? A Treasury of Donald Duck Classics. I can't read it because I'm too far away from it. Let's see, what do we got? The Paddington Treasury, the Little House Picture Book Treasury, the Disney Princess Comic Treasury, all of which was generated by the machine learning algorithm that was the consequence of me looking for the 10-year Treasury rate. So the technology you're producing is not artificial intelligence. It's artificial stupidity, right? You are spawning artificial stupidity at an absolutely unprecedented pace. You ought to be ashamed of yourselves. And so I think that's we'll stop with that whimsical note. And when we come back on Thursday, we'll be prepared to look at the loanable funds model. And please look for those emails that will tell you when all of this exam prep stuff will become available to you. Meanwhile, I recommend the Fairy Princess Treasury collection of all those. That was the one I liked the best.